Do you think memorizing short stories is a good strategy for getting started in Korean? Unlike French, I can't just pick it up by passive listening. Did you become fluent in French by passive listening? Because I didn't. I spent lots of hours watching stuff, listening to stuff. I read over 100 books and I wasn't fluent in French. Over 100 books I read. So yeah, input. It doesn't matter which language, unless you practice your speaking. Just with input, you won't get very far. I mean, your comprehension will get good, but not your speaking. But when it comes to Korean, like when getting started, really difficult language. Very not really difficult, it's just really different. I guess you could call it difficult because the more different it is from the ones you already speak, the more difficult it is. Okay, I guess we can call it difficult. I don't like calling languages difficult because they're really not. If you front load the hard work, like I'm doing with Japanese, they're not difficult. You can okay if you do the right stuff in the beginning. After that, it just becomes easy. So, but okay, let's call it complicated. Complicated language like Korean from the beginning. Short stories, I wouldn't go for that. I know that's the popular thing. There's a lot of language short stories and mini stories and this and that. Okay, and they don't work all that badly, especially things like Asimil. But what I would do is your language islands, which are similar to short stories. In fact, you could tell your own stories of the time you went to this place and you had this experience and that. But start with more simple stuff, talking about yourself, your language islands, and then high frequency vocabulary, most common 100, no 100, 1,000 words or something like that. 100 words and then 500 and 1,000 most common words, nouns and verbs, especially with example sentences. And you use mnemonic associations to memorize the vocabulary as fast as possible. Lots of shadowing then. And then, yeah, you listen to them after memorizing the vocabulary and the shadowing, and you use retrieval practice and space repetition to make sure you learn them really well. But go for the high frequency stuff first. Two types of high frequency vocabulary and sentences. There's the language islands, your language islands, which are high frequency for you because that's the stuff you mostly talk about. If your language islands are good, those are things you will usually talk about. So you should learn those really well. That's the 80-20 rule applied to your own speaking. And then there's the other one, which is the general one, which is the most common words in the language, which is like the most common 1,000 words. You understand more or less 80% of the vocabulary in a sentence. So memorize those as well. I don't think that's anywhere near enough to understand the language well, but it's a start. Start with that. And the stories, I would start doing them. And again, here you talk about memorizing short stories. How do you memorize short stories? I guess if you memorize all the vocab first, using associations, and then you listen to the stories over and over, I guess it works. Yeah, actually, That's a pretty good plan. If you memorize the vocab first with associations, otherwise, you're going to need insane amounts of reading and listening to the same stories over and over again, hundreds of hours to end up understanding the language somewhat. So again, for a language, especially for a language that's complicated because it's very different, focus on doing all the hard work in the beginning, all the key sentences and all the key vocabulary that you will need. Try to memorize it as fast as possible. And the best way to do that is associations. That's my advice. And try to do a lot of shadowing. Start speaking from day one with this because you will have to do it at some point anyway. And if you do it from the very beginning, your listening comprehension will improve from the very beginning. by shadowing. Your speaking will improve faster as well. And you're just much more likely to remember things that you practice actively. Shadowing is active. You're listening and you're repeating sentences. You're much more likely to remember those than just by being exposed to it, by only by input, right? Active is always better than passive. That's my advice.